This is the story of dementia, prevention, the lifestyle factors you can modify so you don't get Alzheimer's. Keep those blood vessels bouncy, your neurons juicy with a few little tricks and a supplement.
cGP, cyclic glycine proline. Put it in my mouth, get it past my BBB, cause it got that ring, it fits like a preventing dementia. Don't let them blood vessels sink under the deep dark dementia sea. Alzheimer, Lewy body, vascular dementia, Parkinson's. IGF-1, insulin like growth factor uno, maintaining and repairing veins and capillaries, keeping blood flowing in and then blood flowing out. And dementia,
Dementia,
out of your life, out of your brain. Oh yeah, say goodbye to dementia.
Yo, D-bag, stop smashing up my brain. If I see you here again, I'm gonna smash in your face. Get out of my life, get out of my brain.
Yeah, with the D and in with the cGP. M-Dubs on the mic, Mick Watts in the house. Mickey went to wacky wackies with my CGF, my cyclic friend. My homie, my hammy Mindy Wiggins from a lab next to Down Under called cGP, rolling deep in NZ, popping caps of cyclic glycine proline. Tasty like breast milk, shaped like black currants, nutrition for your neurons, hope for your grandparents. Beyond the diapers, beyond the dipeptides, don't forget the lifestyle risk factors that you can prevent. Diabetes, hypertension, lack of early education, bad eyes, bad ears, big belly, no friends. So pop on those glasses, rock those hearing aids, jump around, walk around, get them body moving. Now it's time to listen in to the wisdom from my new friend, the CEO of the cGP lab, Amanda Wiggins.
The interview now starts.
Today you're going to teach us about dementia, some of the risk factors, especially the modifiable risk factors, as well as some new ways we can maybe reduce our risk of dementia or perhaps even help people who've already developed it. So let's start off with talking about what are some of the risk factors, specifically modifiable risk factors for dementia.
Yeah, hi Michael, I'd love to. So perhaps just a quick bit of background about myself and how I kind of got interested in this and where I come from, professionally and from an educational perspective. So my background is firmly in the neuroscience space. I did an undergrad honours degree in neuroscience here in New Zealand. I took myself off to Australia, across the ditch, as they say, and did a PhD at the University of Melbourne. And I also spent 4 years doing a postdoc in neuroscience at UCSF in San Francisco. So that was about 19 years ago that I left academia. And since then, I've been working in government regulations around biotechnology. So trying to strike that right balance between sort of innovation and protection. But in the last 11 years, I've actually been working in the business of commercializing science. So particularly interested in the neuroscience aspect of commercializing science. So I thought I'd just give your listeners just a quick background into who I am and how I got to be here talking to you today. My interest, particularly in dementia, was spurred on. We've now had two family members, one who has succumbed to Alzheimer's a couple of years ago and one family member who is suffering with dementia now. And I think, Michael, when you see that up close and personal, it really spurs on a lot of fear in some ways. What can I do myself to protect myself, and what can other people do to protect themselves from ending up like that? Because it's a very, very severe place to end up and not a place anyone does want to end up. So taking all of that into consideration, I was absolutely fascinated to see last year, 2024, the Lancet Commission came out with their latest update on prevention, care and interventions for dementia. So the Lancet Commission is a big group of the world's leading academics and clinicians and caregivers in the dementia space, and they come together every 4 years to review all the latest science around dementia, and then they publish their report. So last year was the latest update. And yeah, in that report, they covered 14 so-called modifiable risk factors for dementia. And what that just means, modifiable, I guess it's fairly obvious, but it means they're things you can modify in your life to reduce your risk of getting dementia later. And what's, to me, the most staggering aspect of this whole dementia prevention area is just around the percentage risk reduction. So if you were to address all these 14 modifiable risk factors identified in the Lancet Commission report, you would reduce your risk of developing dementia by a staggering 45%. So to me, that's pretty phenomenal. And especially when you think about the rates of dementia, I think I read somewhere that there's 10 million new cases diagnosed every year. It's pretty major. And together with the aging population, this is really a big deal. And I guess the whole purpose of me coming on here is to try to make people aware of what you can do, even from quite an early stage in life, to reduce your risk of getting dementia much later.
Well, maybe you can tell me more about the story with your family, of course, withholding certain details that are too private that they maybe don't want people to hear about. But yeah, as much as you can tell us about what their life is like and how it affected yours.
Yeah, look, the first time I, interacted with it was my aunt, who has now passed away with Alzheimer's disease, was a visit we did to her home. And, there were kind of signs before that, actually years before that, but this was the first time it really, was really, really obvious. So my mum and I went to visit her, and it was coming towards dinner time. It was pretty clear that there was no real food in the fridge to cook, and nothing was going to happen. My aunt seemed to be not going to cook dinner, or not even particularly aware that it was kind of getting towards that point of the day. So we decided to go out and get some dinner. Anyway, at some point in the dinner, my mum asks for the salt and pepper. And my aunt goes up to her wallet and gets out her credit card and passes it to my mum. And I think it was really at that moment that we all went, okay, we all thought something was going on. Now that is an absolute sure indication. So yeah, that was probably, I'm going to say that was actually 5 or 6 years ago now. But, just the severity, seeing her then relatively rapidly decline from that point right towards the end, the person is gone. They're like locked in a cage. You can't connect with the person that was your aunt. That person no longer exists. They don't remember you. They don't remember what day it is. It is very heartbreaking. I think that's the word I would use to describe it. You go through the mourning process when the person is still alive, but they're kind of gone in mind and spirit in some ways, or in many ways. Yeah. And the other one, the other family situation with dementia, I guess, is just a bit too current and a bit raw to talk about right now. So maybe we'll just bypass on that one. But so there's lots to say about prevention and what we can all do.
Well, that's perfect. Then let's talk about that. Tell us what we can do to prevent dementia, or at least reduce our risk of developing it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I mentioned before, the Lancet Commission publication on this topic last year identified 14 modifiable risk factors. And the really interesting thing about it is that the first of those modifiable risk factors starts very early in life with education. So education for children, the more education a person has, the less their risk of developing dementia later in life. So that's pretty interesting, right? Like that sort of lays the foundation and supports the concept of that kind of use it or lose it when it comes to your brain. We think about that a lot in terms of our body and our muscle mass, right? But it's also true for your brain, because your brain is an organ that's full of billions and billions of neuronal connections, and we need to use those connections, otherwise they will wither and die. So early childhood education is associated with a lower risk of dementia later. And then you get into the middle part of life, and there's a whole suite of sort of lifestyle factors, many of which won't be a surprise. So things like diabetes, smoking, hypertension, obesity, excessive alcohol, for example, they all increase your risk of dementia later. I think some of the more interesting ones to me are around hearing loss. So having hearing loss can contribute a 7% increase to developing dementia later. That's interesting because it was newly identified in the 2024 report. And there's now a large and incontrovertible amount of evidence linking hearing loss to dementia later in life. And what I like about this is it's relatively easy to fix, right? You can go to get your hearing checked and you can get a hearing aid, and that just solves the problem. So I think it's good to get this information out there. And these days, hearing aids are, small and discreet and compact. You can actually hardly see them. So it's really worth getting your hearing checked, particularly if you're a person who in your younger years, you either partied quite hard right next to the speakers like me, or maybe you were involved in physical labor where there was machinery going. That damage could have occurred sort of much earlier on, and maybe you don't notice. But yeah, and the other thing in that midlife time period around risk factors was mental health, and depression specifically identified as a risk factor later. And I think the thinking there is that for people who suffer from depression, they tend to go out less, interact less, and kind of shut down. And so that in itself, your brain is kind of getting less stimulation. You're hiding away from the world to a certain extent. So that in itself is associated with a 3% risk of dementia later in life. So, yeah, I guess the key message there is if anyone does have mental health troubles, go along and see your doctor and see what can be done, because the long-term consequences are bigger than just what's happening today. And the other interesting angle, so that's the midlife, and we can talk about the kind of the biological mechanisms in there perhaps, but just before moving on to that, the Lancet Commission also identified risk factors later in life, and though there's 3 in there: social isolation, air pollution, and visual loss. And, social isolation is a real thing for older people, right? Some people lose their mobility, they lose their license, their friend group is declining, they maybe aren't able to do the things they used to enjoy doing with others, like taking walks or whatever it is, hobbies and things. So, yeah, just that importance of social connectedness, and also that visual, maintaining good glasses so you can see properly. And again, it kind of speaks to that use it or lose it ethos with the brain. You've got all these billions of connections, and the connections that we use stay alive. Whereas if we don't use our brain, some of those connections would just wither and die.
Yeah, you're right. It seems to be this user or loser kind of thing. Use those circuits in the brain for learning, for socially connecting, for hearing, for vision. So I guess the more we use our brain, probably that's in general gonna reduce our risk. You did mention that you understand some of these biological mechanisms for these midlife risk factors, and of course probably other ones as well. But that sounds fascinating to me. So if you can, before we move on to other things, maybe we can talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So a bunch of the risk factors in the middle part of a person's life relate to vascular damage. So particularly things like obesity, hypertension, diabetes, high blood sugar, they damage blood vessels. They particularly damage blood vessels all over your body, but in your brain has a very high need for constant blood flow. If blood flow is disrupted, neurons die. Neurons need a constant flow of oxygen. So having that constant blood supply is even more important in the brain than it is anywhere else. It's important everywhere, but even more so in the brain. And what happens, quite a few different things happen with your blood vessels in your brain. The artery, so that's the bit that takes blood from your heart around your body, start to lose their integrity. So they get a bit leaky, they lose their elasticity. And what that means is that the overall delivery mechanism to the brain is a bit reduced. But when you actually look in the brain itself, what the capillaries become very leaky. So that capillary supply into that supplies the brain, it's like not having a master builder. They can become leaky, they're poorly constructed, the building of capillaries can happen too fast, and what happens is the endothelial part of the capillary, which is the lining, can be poorly formed, and that allows too much leaking of stuff out and leaking of stuff in. And it just means that blood exchange becomes very compromised. And I saw a really interesting study actually that was using some in silico modeling to model blood flow to the brain. And their modeling showed that for people over the age of 50 onwards, your blood flow to your brain reduces by 0.42% per year on year. So think about that like compounding interest, right? It's not good. And yeah, the upshot of that, what the paper said was that there's a critical point around the age 75 where the build-up of all the damage and all the loss of function essentially reaches a cliff, and it's about age 70, sort of 75 where that happens, build up over the years of the damage, and that's when we know there's a really step change increase in a person's risk of many neurodegenerative diseases. So yeah, once again, it kind of all comes back to that midlife. What are you doing? Are you staying fit? Are you keeping your blood sugar under control? Stop smoking if you're smoking. Think about your blood vessels as essential transport mechanisms, getting the good stuff, the oxygen and the nutrients to your brain, and taking out the cellular waste as well, just as important.
Okay, you just answered my question I was about to ask of what are blood vessels and capillaries, which sounds like a very basic question. You did say that they're there to kind of transport good things into them and take the bad things out of them, but yeah, maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on that. We know we see our blood vessels and perhaps capillaries, but I don't think like the general public, or at least me, has a very good understanding of what exactly they're doing.
Yeah, that's a good, really good question. So, blood vessels are not static. So I like to think about, the hose, your garden hose. You think of it, it's just something that transports water from the tap to your garden, right? But actually, it's bending, it's expanding slightly. If you leave it out in the sun, it's going to get damaged, all of that. And human blood vessels have got layers. They've got a smooth outer layer, and then they've got a cellular inner layer called the endothelium, which is very specific sort of cellular architecture. And then there's what would you call it, like a sort of a hairy lining almost, called the glycocalyx, which is made up of glycoproteins and other things, sugars and things. And I guess together, those three layers really determine the functionality of a blood vessel. And it's a quite a big emerging area of research, and perhaps one that's maybe been a bit overlooked over the years, just how important blood vessel health is. And so what tends to happen to people's blood vessels as they get older, a few things. That smooth muscle layer on the outside tends to constrict a bit. And so that's what causes high blood pressure, which has a whole lot of flow-on problematic effects if your blood pressure is elevated over years, over time, especially in the brain. That I've read some really interesting research that showed that people who have elevated blood pressure, as you can imagine, every time your heart beats, it pushes a bit of blood out, and your vessels have to expand to allow that blood to go through. And what happens with people with high blood pressure, they don't expand as much, they don't relax, vasorelaxation it's called, they stay a bit too tight. And what that does is it causes elevated blood pressure in the brain, which actually leads to bursting of small capillaries. So yeah, high elevated blood pressure is particularly problematic for the brain. It's definitely something to go and have a chat to your doctor about if you do have elevated blood pressure.
If we've damaged our blood vessels have been damaged, can we fix them? Can we bring them back to good health?
Well, kind of. Yes and no. There's no real definitive answer on that. But yes, I mean, blood vessels do rebuild. our bodies are designed to heal themselves, really, right? That's the basic thing. Otherwise, we'd all be dead not long after we're born, right? So yes, you can rebuild blood vessels, but there's a few caveats there. You can have really problematic rebuilding of blood vessels, as I mentioned, the master builder lacking, and the blood vessels can be built in a very haphazard way where they're, I mentioned the 3 layers of a blood vessel, they're not formed properly and they become leaky and they're built in all the wrong places. So that's one challenge. The other is, of course, brain bleeds, and that's something that you definitely don't want. So that's a hemorrhagic stroke. And that tends to be when you get, one of the larger blood vessels has got disrupted blood flow. The molecule that we've been studying, so I'm the CEO of a company called the cGP Lab. We're based here in New Zealand. We've been operating since 2020, and we are commercializing a very special molecule called cyclic glycine proline, or cGP for short. So what makes cGP really interesting is the way it works, its mechanism of action. So it regulates a hormone called IGF-1. And IGF-1's main purpose in life in adults over the age of about 45 is to spur on the proper repair and growth of capillaries, and also sort out the endothelial lining of the bigger blood vessels called arteries. So yeah, that's quite groundbreaking. And I think what makes cGP particularly interesting, it's a small molecule, so it's formed by the combination of 2 amino acids, glycine and proline, and when you put them through quite a prolonged heat period, it cyclizes them. So it's known as a dipeptide, which just means 2 amino acids joined together. It crosses the blood-brain barrier. So because it's small, it can get across the gut into our circulation and into our brain. And we've done a clinical study years ago on Parkinson's patients that proved this high bioavailability. And when it gets into the brain, it works via IGF-1 to help repair and stabilize capillaries. So, yeah, we're pretty excited about that. That has lots of applications in lots of different brain health areas. I think, just circling back to the topic we were on before, Michael, of dementia. So, dementia is an umbrella term. I think there's up to something like 200 different types of dementia now, but the most common form is Alzheimer's disease. A couple of really interesting studies that are implicating IGF-1 signaling and vasculature and cGP in Alzheimer's disease. So there was a huge study of about 3,500 people done in Sweden over the course of about 11 years. The participants were older, 65 plus, and they just simply followed them for a duration of 11 years. So that's called a longitudinal study. And what they found was those who had the lowest IGF-1 activity had a 51% increased chance of developing dementia. And those who were healthy throughout the study, so they didn't get dementia, of those people, the ones who had the highest IGF-1 activity had the largest brain volume. So that's a real sign of neuroprotection. So yeah, that's one of the pieces of evidence that links, healthy IGF-1 function to reducing a person's risk of dementia. And we know that the way cGP works, or actually, did I talk about this? How cGP works? So cGP actually regulates IGF-1. So it doesn't necessarily boost it, but it regulates it. So cGP and IGF-1 compete for the same binding protein. And so when IGF-1 is bound to that binding protein, it's inactive. So it's still in your system. It's just not doing its thing. It's not spurring on the repair of capillaries. And when cGP comes in, it knocks IGF-1 out of that binding protein so that IGF-1 can go and do its thing and get busy building and repairing blood vessels.
Okay, so we need IGF-1, but it's kind of like that Goldilocks thing. We don't want too much or too little. And cGP is kind of helping those levels be in balance, or be in a good spot. Is that what I'm hearing? And maybe also talk about why is IGF-1 important, and how much do we need? Of course, you can't quantify that, but yeah.
Yeah, good question. You're right. We don't want too much IGF-1 and we don't want too little. We want just the right amount. It's really interesting studies done by our chief science officer quite a few years ago now, in vitro studies, so in vitro studies are cell line studies where you can easily manipulate the amount of IGF-1 and cGP. And what she found was that when IGF-1 is low, adding cGP increases the activity of IGF-1, and you measure that by the density of endothelial cells growing in a dish, right? But what she also found was that when IGF-1 was artificially high in cell culture and you put cGP in, cGP actually lowered IGF-1 activity. And again, you measure that by a reduced density of endothelial cells growing on a dish. And it comes back to that mechanism of cGP and IGF-1 competing for binding to the same binding protein. It all comes down to the ratio. And what we see in a lot of diseases and disorders is a much elevated increase in the binding protein, IGF binding protein 3, it's called. So in Alzheimer's, for example, levels of IGF BP3 are really high, right? So that means that IGF-1 is in circulation, but it's bound up. It's not doing the job it's meant to do, getting capillaries formed. And so I guess the suggestion there is that if you could increase the amount of cGP in your system and dislodge some of that IGF-1 to go off and work its magic on capillaries, you'd be in a better place. And in fact, there is quite an interesting study out on this in a transgenic mouse model where the mice are genetically modified to basically develop Alzheimer's really young. And if you give cGP to those mice, they end up with much reduced plaques and tangles in their brain and much better memory, particularly spatial memory. So altogether, it really confirms that potential role for cGP in brain pathologies like Alzheimer's and the broader category of dementia. It's all really, really interesting, right? It points to a role for this vascular remodeling. And we know from lots of studies that the vasculature is heavily impacted in neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and dementia, Parkinson's as well. But I just wanted to also say, because I'm not in the business of giving false hope, that cGP is, unlikely to be an actual cure for Alzheimer's or dementia. There is no cure, unfortunately. But we certainly, we do have people who take our product who are in the earlier stages of those diseases, and they give us pretty amazing feedback. But yeah, I definitely am not out here going, we've got the cure. It's not that. It's really, really interesting science that has a lot of promise.
How do we get cGP? Can our bodies naturally produce it? Can we get it from nutrition? I know the dipeptide that you mentioned, that cGP is made up of glycine and proline, and I imagine we can get these amino acids from nature, from nutrition. But the question is, can our bodies make it at that point, or do we have to, which isn't a bad option, do we have to consume it in the form of a pill or an injection or something like that? How do we get it?
Yeah, you're right. So some forms of collagen have relatively high glycine and proline amino acids, but they tend to be just that, separate amino acids. So when you ingest them, they are absorbed and used as amino acids and built into your body as muscle, or however they use lots of different ways. But the actual cyclized version, so cyclic glycine proline, cannot be got from normal dietary sources. In our company, we've tested, I don't even know what the number is now. It's probably like 200 different food sources to see which ones have the highest cGP. And actually what we found is that most food sources have a really low level of cGP, the cyclized glycine and proline. And to get cGP, you need to put your glycine and your proline through a prolonged heating and pressure step to get that chemical reaction. So the way we do that is we combine New Zealand grown black currants, which do have some cGP in them, and glycine and proline, together with a particular very specific type of New Zealand collagen. We put them through the stepped heating and pressure process, and out the end we get a standardized cGP powder. To your other point, do we make it ourselves? Yes, we do. We do make some cGP. So you know how I talked about cGP and IGF-1 and the binding protein. So when IGF-1 gets lodged out of that binding protein, it's not very stable in our circulation. It gets enzymatically broken down in a couple of minutes. And one of the breakdown products after a couple of steps is cGP. So yes, we are making it, but what happens is our body is not able to make enough often when we've got these situations where our IGF-1 system is severely dysregulated. So in diseases like the ones I've mentioned, dementia, Parkinson's and whatnot, and also increasing emerging sort of picture around diabetes as well, that the IGF-1 system is heavily dysfunctional. So in those situations, our body is trying to make more and more and more cGP, but what we know is that that ratio is the most important thing, and we're unable to make enough. Yeah, and that's cGP being the key homeostasis mechanism for IGF-1. That's really the life's work of our chief science officer, Dr. Jian Guan. She's been researching this for about 30 years, and she's very, very passionate about it, and we're very, very, very fortunate to have her in the company.
Okay. And so I'm trying to make sure I got it right. So IGF-1 is this hormone that is important for the health of our brain capillaries and vessels, their repair, their growth, their maintenance, etc. And cGP makes sure that we have the right amount of it. Basically, the end goal is to keep our capillaries and or vessels healthy. And I guess then the goal of that is to, to be happy and healthy and not have dementia. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Good summary, Michael. Love it.
Woo. I just want to make sure I'm getting it. What are some other ways that we can support the health of our blood vessels and capillaries? There are those lifestyle factors you mentioned, diet and exercise and not getting diabetes and all those things. But what else can we do?
Yeah, well, physical inactivity is a really interesting one, right? So especially in the middle part of our lives, middle age, it seems to have this kind of cumulative effect that it just, the lack of physical activity just kind of builds up over your life to end up in a pretty unhealthy space. I'm really interested in this from a research perspective, but also from a personal perspective, because I am a busy CEO. I'm a mother of 2 teenagers who still require quite a bit of driving around everywhere. So, my life is pretty busy. I've got all of this knowledge around what to do to make my brain healthy for the longest possible time. But I still struggle with being as physically active as I would like because I'm just really time poor. But what I'm really loving is what's coming out at the moment, the research on just what is the minimum amount you need of activity. And there's pretty good evidence that even 15 minutes of brisk walking a day makes a huge difference. So, gosh, I mean, even the busiest schedules can fit in 15 minutes a day. So I try to do that every single day at a minimum. I work out. I mean, there's huge benefits to doing muscle training as well, obviously. So I'm not saying don't do that. I'm just saying at a minimum, if you're a person who's as busy as I am, just know 15 minutes a day is your minimum and just make that non-negotiable in your own brain. So that's a real take home.
And walking doesn't have to take away our time, our time for productivity and work, etc. But I mean, again, if we live in certain cultures with certain lack of infrastructure, maybe you do have to deliberately go out there and walk around the block. Say you're living in most places in the United States. I'm lucky to be in Japan where walking is a form of transportation. So that's quite useful. I just kind of have to walk. And I don't know how it is in New Zealand. It might have to be a deliberate kind of act. But even then, whatever, it's 15, 20 minutes. But I'm sure there's some point in everybody's life where walking could just be a form of transportation, like walking into the supermarket or walking to the mailbox. That's a classic one. So this is a pretty cool tool, and it doesn't have to take away from our, productivity and work and, being a good mother and CEO, etc. So this is a good one. I like this, and I do love walking, so I'm happy to hear that.
Yeah. I try to go first thing in the morning. It's just done because I find if I leave it till later in the day, my best intentions just get quashed by every other thing. So for me, it's a first thing in the morning, get up and go type thing. Otherwise, it won't happen. And, the other thing about exercise is you can kind of tick a couple of boxes with it. If you are a bit organized, you can also arrange to meet a friend and do your exercise. And that ticks the box of, avoiding social isolation as well. So you're kind of ticking two protective factors there at once, which I love. And also exercising with a friend keeps you on track, right? Because you don't want to let your friend down standing on a cold corner on a cold morning. You're going to turn up and that's beneficial.
You mentioned the story of how you got interested in dementia or, worried about it. But what's the story behind cGP? How did you discover this? Or, of course, you're not the discoverer in the sense of like a inventor. I don't, well, maybe you are. Then that's even a more fascinating thing. Yeah, how did you get into cGP?
Yeah, I was working with the team at cGP a few years ago when I was working as a consultant to the health and dietary supplement industry, and just kind of got to know them over the course of about a year. And I really, to me, I think the thing that really, really piqued my interest was this: it crosses the blood-brain barrier, where it does, like the mechanism around IGF-1 and the capillary growth is really well established. That's been published for years. But to me, when I heard that it crossed the blood-brain barrier, I just wow, there's so much potential there to make such a big difference. I had a bit of I wouldn't say a checkered past, but I think somewhere in my journey of being an academic research scientist, I realized it's probably not for me. I'm not the best researcher in the world. I think there was one particular week there at UCSF in San Francisco where I had one of the microscope rooms booked out for the whole week, which just means you turn up to work, you go into a dark room, you look down a microscope, and you might be counting neurons that day or taking photos, which you then subsequently need to, get sort out. And I think, by the end of that week, I just came out of that room and I just thought, this is just not for me. I'm not born to be in a dark room generating data. Other people can do that better than me and also better suited to their personality. So I realized at that point, I don't want to be one of the ones who's doing this important work in labs. I want to be one of the ones who's out there taking it to the people, making an impact, commercializing it. So yeah, when I was working in San Francisco, I was a member of the American Society for Cell Biology back in the day. And they would organize lobbying trips out to Washington, D.C., where you go and meet up with a whole lot of other scientists and you'd go around and visit senators and talk to them about R&D funding. And you'd essentially advocate to increase the R&D budget in the US. And I think it was at about that point when I was feeling quite disillusioned with all my sitting in dark rooms counting neurons that, I realized, gosh, there's this whole other world out there of science where you can make an even bigger impact, right? Because having the right science budget, for example, for a country is incredibly important to allow ideas to proliferate and allow scientists to do what they do best, which is discover knowledge and new stuff. And so, yeah, it was kind of those advocacy trips that I did out to DC that spurred me on to want to go from being an academic researcher into the broader world of scientific impact. So, yeah, after that, when I came back to New Zealand after that, so that was about 19 years ago, and then I got into the regulatory space. I was working for the government here as a senior advisor on some of the big biotech and human health regulations. And that was, again, it's that broad picture of how do you allow innovation to flourish in society for the benefit of all of us. And now I'm in the business end where it's taking those ideas and productizing them, right? Getting it into a product where someone can take cGP, for example, to support their brain as they age. And I just love it. I love it. I love that I've been in the research world. I've seen it. It's blimmin' hard. Hats off to these brilliant people who continue with their research careers and continue to generate new ideas. And then there's someone like me who just wants to help them take those ideas out to the people.
And the government, specifically the section of it that you're working with, is supposedly there to help people and also protect people. And then the blood-brain barrier. is also kind of doing this. You mentioned that cGP, cyclic glycine proline, crosses the blood-brain barrier, and that is exciting, but it's also, scary. It could be scary because the BBB is there for a reason, just as the government's there for a reason. These analogies don't really line up, but that's fine. The question is, what are some of the risks involved with cGP, if any, or what are some things that we don't know yet about it? Some potential risks, some uncertainties.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we've been in market with our dietary supplement brand, which is called cGP Max, for about 2.5 years now. And we keep a pretty detailed log of any adverse events. And there's been very minimal adverse events reported to us over the years. So that's one thing. We have completed one clinical trial, which is just under review for publication at the moment. So that was actually a trial in people who had type 2 diabetes and a condition called peripheral neuropathy, which is where the nerves in the feet deteriorate and die off. And in that clinical study, there were no adverse events reported. So that gives us, a really good, strong indication that the likelihood of adverse events is quite low. However, we're now planning another clinical trial, a bigger one, and we will continue to monitor that aspect. Safety, very, very important. I think the thing that comes up most often as a question is, what's the role of IGF-1 in cancer? So IGF-1 overexpression is implicated in a few different types of cancer, including prostate cancer. And, the last thing you really want to do is to spur that on, right? If you've got too much IGF-1, and we know that IGF-1 also reduces cellular apoptosis, reduces cell death. So that combination, you definitely do not want to spur that on in cancer, right? A number of researchers have looked at this aspect in relation to cGP. So the class of compounds that cGP belongs to, cyclic dipeptides, has actually been studied, and there's a few patents lodged on it for its anti-cancer properties. And that those studies have been done in cell lines where researchers are growing particular cells in culture that overexpress or have an abundance of IGF-1, right? And then they're giving cGP and they're seeing what happens. And what they've found consistently is that cGP actually slows down the proliferation of those cancer cells in a dish. So that is a good, strong safety signal. The other really interesting research, this one was actually done by our chief research scientist, Dr. Guan. It was a mouse study in which mice were inoculated with a strain of cancerous cells that overexpresses IGF-1 receptor. And they did 2 different studies. And what happens when you inoculate mice with cancer is they will inevitably grow tumors and succumb to cancer eventually. So they did 2 studies, one in which they inoculated mice with these cancer cells, and at the same time they started feeding them cGP. One group cGP, one group no cGP. And at the time of death, they count the number of tumors and note the size. And cGP treatment significantly reduced the number of tumors and the size of tumors that did form. The other study they did was very similar. Again, they inoculated these mice with cells overexpressing the IGF-1 receptor, but they delayed introducing cGP. So in doing so, that sort of allowed the tumors to take hold and progress before cGP was given, as opposed to right at the start. And what they found again was that those mice who had been given cGP had reduced both number and size of tumors that developed. The reduction wasn't as big as in the other study where cGP was given right from the start, but it was still a statistically significant reduction. So I think, when it comes to, side effects and potential downsides, that cancer risk is the main one that people ask us about. And we are no means advocating any kind of anti-cancer activity because I don't think that's the place of dietary supplements. But from what we know so far, all indications are that cGP tends to rein in IGF-1 associated cancers.
Okay. And this is a dietary supplement. I'm still trying to get a grip on what exactly it is. Is it a supplement? Is it a kind of pharmaceutical? What is it? And then I have another question, which is who takes it? Is it for prevention? Is it for people already with dementia? Both? These are two different questions I'm throwing at you at the same time.
Yeah, so it's a dietary supplement, the range that we sell under cGP Max. Our customers tend to, I think 97% of them are over the age of 45. So it's for people who are in that middle age and kind of beyond. And the main reason they take it is because they want to safeguard their future brain health. We do have some customers that we know of who do have dementia and take the product as a sort of adjunct support. And we get some pretty amazing feedback from them, but it's not specifically targeting that. It's really targeting people who are in that kind of 45 plus age who want to make sure they're doing everything they can to safeguard their future brain health. Is it a drug? I think that was your other question. It's not a drug, but interestingly, there is an FDA-approved drug that's a synthetic analog of cGP that was approved in 2023 for the treatment of a rare disease called Rett syndrome. So that research was actually spun out of the University of Auckland here in New Zealand. The early part of it was done at University of Auckland by our chief scientist and some other people. And what we know with Rett syndrome is their IGF-1 system is terribly dysfunctional, mainly due to the massive upregulation of the binding protein, IGF binding protein 3, that renders IGF-1 basically dysfunctional, non-functional. So yeah, there is a synthetic analog of cGP out on the market as a drug. I think it's only approved in the US at this point. And we actually have quite a lot of families of parents of children who have Rett syndrome who buy our product. We don't market it for that. Dietary supplements are for general wellness, not serious diseases and conditions. So that's kind of an aside, but is a pretty interesting, validation in terms of an approved pharmaceutical that's very similar. It's had a wee tweak to the structure, and it's not absorbed as well. So unfortunately, with that particular drug, which is called trofinetide, you do actually have to give quite large doses to get it absorbed into the body, which comes with a lot of gastrointestinal side effects from what I read.
Okay, so we talked about some uncertainties, some risks, but there's also some positive uncertainties. What are some realistic hopes you have for this?
Yeah, gosh. Where I mentioned a clinical trial that was done in people with type 2 diabetes who had a complication of diabetes called peripheral neuropathy. We got amazing results. So we got a statistically significant improvement in the peripheral neuropathy scores after 3 months of taking our product. And that's pretty life-changing because currently there's nothing on the market for peripheral neuropathy. There's only pain treatments, pain medication. We're now doing a cap raise to get the funds to do a larger gold standard clinical trial in this space. So what's really fascinating and pretty exciting about this is the way cGP works via that IGF-1 mechanism. We also saw really, and we were all surprised, a reduction in HbA1c, which is blood sugar that's bound to your red blood cells. So that could be quite game-changing if we're able to really dig into that mechanism a bit better. We know that IGF-1 binds to insulin receptors, and so does insulin, obviously. But the underlying problem in diabetes is lack of sensitivity to insulin. So if we could prove out what our theory is, that cGP improves insulin sensitivity, that would be a game changer for so many people who have pre-diabetes and diabetes. So we're working on that at the moment. And it may seem a bit left field to brain health, but actually, metabolic health and brain health are very intimately connected, and that's through that vascular degeneration aspect that we've spoken about.
Oh yeah. I've had a few guests talking specifically about that link. And we focus today on dementia, but cyclic glycine proline is helping our vascular health in general. So what are some other non-dementia conditions or situations that this could also help with?
Yeah. So, great question. We know that Parkinson's disease has got a heavy vascular dysfunction component. And actually, before the company was even founded, the guys who founded the company did an earlier study with Parkinson's patients where they gave them blackcurrant capsules. And it turned out that that's how they found out that blackcurrants contain an amount of cGP. And what they saw in that study was that these patients had much improved mood scores, so their anxiety and depression went down. So, yeah, in that study, unfortunately, it was a much earlier version of cGP max, and the dose of cGP was a bit low. But yeah, there's huge potential around Parkinson's disease. There's a lot of research around what happens with IGF-1 after stroke and also traumatic brain injury, so head knocks on the sports field. We know that even one mild TBI significantly increases your risk of dementia later. So if you could sort that at the time by boosting up your cGP and sorting out your IGF-1, that could potentially be very, very beneficial. You think of how many head knocks are going on in kids' sport on a Saturday morning globally. Wow.
Well, thank you for teaching us about dementia, risk factors, some things we can do to reduce our risk, blood vessels, vascular health, and then this new exciting supplement, cGP. Thank you so much for this time today. If people want to connect with you or learn more about any of this, where can they go?
Yeah, well, you can look me up with my LinkedIn. That's probably the best place to find me. We have a science website that talks all about the science behind cGP, which is cgp-health.com. Our supplement brand is also available online for sale, of course. We ship internationally, and that's cgpmax.com. And we'd love to hear from any of your listeners.
Thanks again, Amanda. I'm happy we can connect, and I'm looking forward to learning more about this. And yeah, I don't know if I want to try it. I'm kind of scared about all these things, but yeah, I do. Yeah, I do want to try it and see how it goes.
Awesome. Everyone needs blood flow to their brain.